Pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart. The really great man must, I think, have great sadness on earth. These haunting words from Fyodor Dostoyevsky's masterpiece, Crime and Punishment, still echoes across time, challenging us to confront the most fundamental questions of human existence. What makes an action moral or immoral? Can rational thought alone guide our ethical choices? And, perhaps most disturbingly, can extraordinary circumstances justify extraordinary transgressions? Today we are diving into one of the most psychologically penetrating novels ever written, a work that doesn't just tell a story but dissects the very anatomy of guilt, redemption, and what it means to be human in a world filled with suffering. For those of you following along with our 2025 reading challenge, this is our April selection. Each month we are exploring a transformative work that has changed how we think about ourselves and our world. Crime and Punishment certainly fits that description, offering insights that remain startlingly relevant more than 150 years after its publication. So, before we explore the philosophical labyrinth of Crime and Punishment, let's briefly meet its creator, a man whose own life reads like one of his tormented characters. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoyevsky was born in Moscow in 1821, the son of a military sergeant. His early years were comfortable enough, but tragedy struck when his mother died of tuberculosis when he was just 17. 2 years later, his father was murdered, allegedly, by his own serfs, a traumatic event that would leave permanent scars on Dostoevsky's psyche and surely influence his writing profoundly. As a young man, Dostoevsky became involved with radical intellectual circles in St. Petersburg. This association led to his arrest in 1849 for alleged subversive activities against Tsar Nicholas I. He was sentenced to death by firing squad, only to receive a last-minute reprieve, but not before experiencing the psychological torture of believing he was moments away from execution. This mock execution was deliberately staged as part of his punishment. Instead of death, Dostoevsky was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor in Siberia, followed by mandatory military service. 3 years of imprisonment exposed him to the suffering of common criminals and the darkest concerns of human experience. What emerged from his crucible was not bitterness, but a profound spiritual transformation. Dostoevsky returned to society with a renowned Orthodox faith and a deeper understanding of human psychology, especially the psychology of suffering, guilt, and redemption. It was in this context, personal tragedy, political persecution, imprisonment, and spiritual rebirth, that Crime and Punishment emerged in 1866. First as a serial publication in a literary journal called The Russian Messenger, so Ruski Vestnik in Russian. The 1860s in Russia was a period of immense social upheaval. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861 had transformed Russian society, and radical new philosophies were taking hold among the intelligentsia, so intelligence. Particularly influential was the concept of rational egoism, so the idea that self-interest, guided by reason, should be the basis of morality. Some young radical took these ideas to extreme conclusions, arguing that extraordinary individuals were justified in transgressing moral boundaries for the greater good. After all, hadn't great historical figures like Napoleon broke conventional morality to advance civilization? Dostoevsky was deeply disturbed by these currents of thought. Having survived his own filtration with radical ideologies and witnessed their consequences, he saw in these philosophies the seeds of moral catastrophe. Crime and Punishment was his response, a profound psychological and philosophical examination of what happens when abstract theories collide with human reality. For those unfamiliar with the novel, let me sketch its contours. Our protagonist is Rodion Raskolnikov, a former law student living in abject poverty in St. Petersburg. Intelligent but deeply alienated, Raskolnikov has developed a theory that divides humanity into two categories: ordinary people who must obey moral laws, and extraordinary individuals who are basically permitted to transgress these laws in service of a higher purpose, or whatever they perceive as a higher purpose. To test his theory and to solve his financial problems, Raskolnikov murders an elderly pawnbroker with an axe. In the process, he is forced to kill her innocent sister, who unexpectedly arrives at the scene. The remainder of the novel traces the psychological aftermath of this crime, as Raskolnikov wrestles with guilt, paranoia, and physical illness, while evading detection by the clever detective Porfiry Petrovich. Along the way, Raskolnikov encounters a cast of different characters who reflect different aspects of his moral dilemma. Sonia Marmeladov, a young woman forced into prostitution to support her family, who represents selfless love and Christian redemption. Svirdigayov, a dissolute landowner who embodies the moral emptiness of pure self-interest. And Razumikin, Raskolnikov's loyal friend who represents healthy and grounded humanity. The novel reaches its climax when Raskolnikov, partly through Sonia's influence, confesses his crime and accepts punishment, a step that begins the long journey toward moral and spiritual regeneration. But the plot is merely the skeleton. The flesh and blood of crime and punishment is its psychological depth and philosophical richness at the same time. Let's explore some of its central philosophical themes then. At the heart of crime and punishment lies Raskolnikov's theory of the extraordinary man, a philosophical justification for his crime that echoes Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, though Dostoyevsky's novel predates Nietzsche's writings on these subjects, which is important. Raskolnikov articulates his theory in an article he had written before the murder. I simply hinted that an extraordinary man has the right, not an official right, of course, but a private right to allow his conscience to step over certain obstacles, and only in the event that the execution of his idea, sometimes perhaps salutary for the whole of mankind, calls for it. This theory divides humanity into two categories: the ordinary, who exist merely to reproduce their kind and must obey conventional morality, and the extraordinary, like Napoleon, for example, who have the right to transgress moral boundaries in service of their greater purpose. So what makes this theory so dangerous and so modern at the same time is its rational utilitarian calculation. Raskolnikov responds that the pawnbroker is a louse, a harmful parasite whose death would benefit society. He imagines the good he could do with her money, helping his sister avoid a loveless marriage of convenience and furthering his own education so he can benefit humanity. Dostoevsky is showing us the terrifying logic of consequentialism, untethered from moral absolutes, a philosophy that judges actions solely by their outcomes rather than their inherent rightness. Through Raskolnikov's mental anguish following the murder, Dostoevsky suggests that such mathematical morality fails to account the psychological reality of human being. What Raskolnikov discovers, and what constitutes one of the novel's most profound insights, is that transgression isn't merely an intellectual proposition, but a psychological event that transforms the transgressor. After the murder, Raskolnikov falls into a feverish state, alternating between delirium and lucidity. He becomes isolated, paranoid, and physically ill, far from feeling empowered by his supposed leap into extraordinariness. He feels alienated from humanity. As Dostoevsky writes, he was crushed by poverty, But even his reduced circumstances had ceased to burden him of late. His essential daily task had ceased to be a concern to him. He had retreated like a tortoise into his shell. Through this portrayal, Dostoyevsky suggests that moral boundaries are not merely social conventions, but are somehow woven into the fabric of our being. To violate them is to violate ourselves, to become divided against our own nature. This insight anticipates Freud's concept of the superego by decades. Raskolnikov's rationalism attempts to silence his conscience, but his body and unconscious mind rebel through illness, nightmares, and compulsive returns to the sin of his crime. So, if transgression wounds the soul, what heals it? Here Dostoyevsky offers a distinctly Christian answer: suffering freely accepted. This theme is embodied by Sonia Marmadalov, perhaps the novel's most morally complex character, because she was forced into prostitution to support her family. Sonia lives in a state of perpetual self-sacrifice and suffering. Yet, unlike Raskolnikov, she doesn't attempt to rationalize or escape her condition through abstract theories. She accepts it, finding strength in the Christian faith. When Raskolnikov confesses his crime to her, she doesn't offer intellectual justifications or easy absolution. Instead, she tells him, "Go at once, this very minute. Stand at the crossroads. Bow down. First kiss the earth which you have defiled, and then bow down to all the world and say to all men aloud, 'I'm a murderer.' Then God will send you life again." For Dostoyevsky, who had found renewed faith during his own imprisonment, suffering is not meaningless if freely accepted as the necessary consequence of one's actions. This acceptance becomes the first step toward redemption. Not because suffering itself has value, but because it breaks down the pride and rationalism that separates us from our common humanity. The epilogue, set in a Siberian prison camp, shows Raskolnikov beginning this journey. Though he initially remains unrepentant, a dream reveals the emptiness of his rational egoism, taken to its logical conclusion. A world where everyone believes themselves extraordinary and justified in eliminating others. It's only as he embraces Sonia's love and begins to accept his punishment that the possibility of resurrection appears. For those following our 2025 reading challenge, you might notice how strikingly Crime and Punishment contrasts with our January and February selections in its treatment of guilt and redemption. Unlike Marceau in Camille the Stranger, whom we have explored in January, Raskolnikov cannot maintain his emotional detachment after his crime. When Marceau drifts through his murder and trial with an almost clinical indifference, feeling neither remorse nor any need for redemption, Raskolnikov is consumed by his deed. Marceau rejects society's moral framework entirely, seeing no inherent meaning in his actions. For him, the universe is indifferent, and guilt is merely a social construct he refuses to accept. And what a contrast to February's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Whilst protagonist indulges in ever-increasing moral corruption, while his portrait bears the physical manifestation of his sins. Dorian, like Raskolnikov, commits murder, but unlike the tormented Russian student, he feels no guilt whatsoever. Dorian's narcissism allows him to displace his conscience entirely onto the painting, creating a perfect psychological separation between his actions and their moral consequences. Only when forced to confront his true self does his world collapse. Dostoyevsky presents a profoundly different vision. For him, conscience isn't merely a social construct, or an inconvenient burden to be outsourced. It's an inescapable aspect of human nature. Raskolnikov can theorize his way into murder, but he cannot rationalize away the psychological aftermath. His suffering isn't just social punishment, is the natural consequence of violating what Dostoyevsky sees as a moral law, which is embedded in human nature itself. Through these three protagonists, so Marcel, Dorian, and Raskolnikov, we see three vastly different approaches to guilt. The existential rejection of moral meaning altogether, the narcissistic displacement of conscience, and the tormented recognition of transgression that opens the path to redemption. Only in Dostoevsky's world is redemption not only possible, but necessary for psychological wholeness. Throughout Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky stages a philosophical battle between abstract rationalism and embodied human experience. Raskolnikov's initial theory is a perfect example of rationalism, divorced from reality. It's mathematically elegant, sacrifice one harmful life to benefit many others, but it fails to account for the messy, visceral reality of taking human life. Dostoevsky shows how this rationalism must inevitably collapse when it encounters the physical and psychological reality of human existence. The critique of pure rationalism connects Dostoevsky to existential philosophers, like Kierkegaard, for example, who argued that abstract systems can never fully capture the subjective experience of being human. It also anticipates later phenomenologists who emphasize that we don't experience the world as detached observers, but as embodied participants. The figure of detective Porfiry Petrovich embodies this counterpoint to Raskolnikov's rationalism. Rather than relying solely on evidence and logic, he intuits Raskolnikov's guilt through careful observation of his psychological state. He tells Raskolnikov, "I'm a practical man myself, and there's a lot you might learn from that, if you are capable of seeing and observing. It's not an abstract theory, it's a feeling, a heartfelt feeling." In many ways, Crime and Punishment is an extended argument that moral truth isn't just something we think about. It's something we feel and live. Our bodies know it even when our minds try to deny it. Another philosophical current running through the novel is the tension between free will and determinism, a debate that was particularly active in Dostoevsky's Russia. The radical intellectuals of Dostoevsky's day were heavily influenced by deterministic theories that viewed human behavior as the product of social and environmental forces. In this view, crime was not a moral failing, but a symptom of social injustice. Reform society and crime would disappear. While Dostoevsky was deeply concerned with social injustice, the novel vividly portrays the crushing poverty of St. Petersburg, for example. He rejected any philosophy that diminished individual moral responsibility. Through Raskolnikov, he shows that even in the most desperate circumstances, we retain the freedom to choose our actions. What makes Raskolnikov's crimes so terrible is precisely that it was a choice, motivated not by hunger or immediate necessity, but by pride and intellectual hubris. His redemption begins only when he stops seeing himself as a passive victim of circumstances and accepts responsibility for his actions. This insistence on moral freedom in the face of social determinism makes Dostoevsky's work particularly relevant today. When we continue to debate the balance between social factors and personal responsibility in understanding human behavior. More than 150 years after its publication, Crime and Punishment remains startlingly relevant to our contemporary moral landscape. We live in an age of utilitarian calculus, where the greatest good for the greatest number often serves as our primary ethical framework. We have witnessed the horrors that can result when individuals or groups decide they are extraordinary enough to transgress smaller boundaries for some perceived greater good. And we continue to grapple with questions of justice, punishment, and redemption in our criminal justice systems. The novel also speaks to our modern psychological understanding. Raskolnikov's fragmented psyche, his alienation, and his battle with himself feel remarkably contemporary. His attempt to live by pure reason at the expense of emotion and connection resonates in our technological age, where efficiency and optimization can sometimes override human values. Perhaps most importantly, Crime and Punishment challenges the moral relativism that can characterize modern thought. Without preaching or moralizing, Dostoevsky suggests that moral boundaries are not merely cultural constructs, but are somehow intrinsic to human flourishing. Transgression doesn't just break social rules, it breaks the transgressor. As we close our exploration of this remarkable novel, it's worth noting that the title itself contains a profound insight. In Russian, the word for crime, so преступление, literally means stepping across, suggesting transgression of a boundary. Punishment, наказание, shares a root with the word for instruction or lesson. The novel, then, is not merely about breaking laws and facing consequences. It's about human need for boundaries and the wisdom that can emerge from accepting rather than evading the consequences of our actions. Dostoevsky surely doesn't offer easy answers or moral formulas. Instead, he invites us into the messy and complex reality of being human. With all our capacity for rationalization, self-deception, suffering, and redemption. In our world of increasingly abstract moral calculations, Crime and Punishment reminds us that ethics isn't just a problem to be solved, but a reality to be lived. Our moral choices don't just affect others, they transform us. And perhaps most hopefully, Dostoevsky suggests that even after our worst transgressions, the possibility of redemption remains open. Not through clever justifications, but through difficult path of acceptance, suffering, and love. Thank you for joining me for this exploration of Dostoevsky's philosophical masterpiece. Before we go, I'm excited to announce our reading challenge selection for May. And it's On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous by Vuong. No one guesses this time. The stunning novel takes the form of a letter from a Vietnamese-American son to his illiterate mother, exploring themes of identity, trauma, beauty, and immigrant experience. It's a lyrical meditation on family, love, and language that I think will provide a fascinating contrast to Dostoevsky's psychological intensity. It's also the most recent novel that we'll be reading. And for our June selection, let me offer you this hint. We'll be examining a profoundly moving work by a psychiatrist who survived the concentration camps of World War II and developed a therapeutic approach centered on finding meaning even in the most difficult circumstances. If you think you know what it is, drop your guess in the comments. Okay, if you enjoyed this discussion of Crime and Punishment, I encourage you to check out our previous analysis of George Orwell's 1984, where we explored another masterpiece that examines the individual's relationship to power, ideology, and truth. As always, thank you for watching and for reading along with us, if you did so. You can consider giving me a like and sharing this video with others who might appreciate it. Okay guys, until next time, and have a good read of our next book. Goodbye.